The notebook was still readable. That was the first thing that stunned the investigator who found it. Not that it existed. Not that it had survived inside a chest freezer in the basement of a condemned house in Greer, South Carolina for nearly 4 decades. But that the handwriting on the pages was still clear. A child's handwriting. Careful block letters in blue ink, slightly uneven in the way of a hand that had not yet found its full confidence, filling page after page with dates and names and small, precise notations that no one was supposed to survive long enough to write down. On the cover, in the same careful hand, 3 words: "My important things." On the morning of March 8, 2023, when Detective Sergeant Anita Rawls of the Greenville County Sheriff's Office pulled that notebook from a plastic bag sealed inside a freezer that had not been opened since the early 1980s, she understood immediately what she was holding. She had been looking for Nora Caswell for 39 years, and Nora Caswell had been looking back. Greer, South Carolina sits in the upper corner of the state where the Piedmont country begins to rise toward the Blue Ridge foothills. And in the summer of 1983, it had the particular quality of a town in the middle of deciding what it wanted to become. The textile mills that had defined Spartanburg County for 3 generations were beginning their long contraction. And the people who had built their lives around them, people like Dale Caswell, who ran a second-shift maintenance crew at the Monaghan plant, were watching the future arrive with the same cautious attention they gave to weather. Main Street had a 5 and dime, a barber shop, a pharmacy with a soda counter that still served cherry cokes, and a Western Auto where Dale picked up parts on Saturday mornings and where the conversations were long and the coffee was free and nobody was in a hurry to be anywhere else. Dale and his wife June had 2 children. Their older daughter, Priscilla, was 14 in 1983, old enough to be absorbed in the serious business of high school and beginning to put some distance between herself and the family's orbit in the natural way of teenagers everywhere. Their younger daughter was Nora, who was 9 and who was not putting any distance between herself and anything. Nora was constitutionally incapable of distance. She was the kind of child who came home from school and told you everything that had happened, in order, including the parts that didn't matter, because to her, all of it mattered. She had a best friend named Charlene, who lived 2 doors down, and with whom she conducted an ongoing project of documenting the neighborhood, its dogs, its birds, its front porches, and their occupants. In a series of notebooks she kept in a shoebox under her bed. She wore her hair in 2 braids that June retied every morning before school, because Nora always managed to loosen them on the bus. She had recently decided that she wanted to be a veterinarian, a decision she had communicated with the gravity of a formal declaration. The Caswell house on Orchard Hill Drive was a modest 2-story on a street of similar houses, the kind of neighborhood where people left their garage doors open in summer and children moved freely between yards, and everyone's back gate was unlocked, and nobody thought twice about it. The mill's shift schedules meant that Dale worked evenings 3 days a week, and that June managed the household with a quiet competence that kept everything running on a schedule that even Nora could not fully disrupt. On the evening of July 19, 1983, June called Nora in from the backyard at 8:15, as she always did. Nora was not in the backyard. She was not in the house. She was not at Charlene's. That was the last ordinary evening on Orchard Hill Drive for a very long time. Nora Caswell, 9 years old, was gone. The shoebox under Nora's bed was the first thing June showed deputies when they arrived at 9 o'clock. Not because she thought it was evidence. She didn't know yet what anything was. But because it was Nora, and she wanted the people looking for her daughter to know who Nora was before they started looking. The shoebox held 6 notebooks, all of them filled. The 7th, the current one, the one Nora had been working in, was missing. It was not under the bed. It was not on her desk. It was not anywhere in the house. June told the responding deputy, a man named Officer Gary Ledbetter, that Nora took that notebook everywhere, that she slept with it on the nightstand, that she would not have gone anywhere without it willingly. By 9:30 that evening, a patrol unit was running the 2-block radius around the house. By 10, Dale had been reached at the plant and was driving home. By 11:15, 3 additional units had joined the search, and the Greer Police Department had issued a missing child bulletin to neighboring agencies in Spartanburg and Greenville counties. At midnight, a neighbor on the far end of Orchard Hill Drive, a man named Herbert Voss, 62, who had been sitting on his front porch that evening in the heat, reported seeing a car he did not recognize moving slowly up the street around 7:45. He described it as a pale car, maybe white or light yellow, a sedan, American-made, moving slowly, not stopping, just moving, the way a car moves when the driver is looking for an address or looking for something else entirely. The pale car. Deputy Ledbetter logged it. It was the only anomalous detail anyone reported that evening. It was the only thread the investigation would have for almost 40 years. No trace of Nora Caswell was found in the initial search. No footprints beyond the yard. No clothing on the street. No witnesses beyond Herbert Voss and his slow, pale car. The search expanded over the following 5 days to cover a 4-mile radius, drainage ditches, the undeveloped land behind the neighborhood, a creek bed 3 blocks east that children were known to use as a shortcut. Nothing. Nora was simply not there. She had taken the notebook with her, or the notebook had been taken with her. And in the terrible accounting of that fact lay the first suggestion that wherever Nora had gone, she had not gone alone, and she had not gone willingly. The notebook. Everyone who knew her knew she wouldn't let it go. The Greer Police Department assigned the case to Detective Corporal James "Jim" Tully, a 15-year veteran who ran missing persons and who had, in those 15 years, developed the habit of writing the victim's name at the top of every page of his case notes, not as a procedural step, but as a reminder to himself of what the paperwork was actually about. He wrote Nora Caswell at the top of every page, in capital letters, for the rest of his working life. In the first weeks, Tully developed 2 principal lines of inquiry. The first followed Herbert Voss's pale car through a canvass of every light-colored American sedan registered in Spartanburg and Greenville counties, a list that approached 300 vehicles. Tully and a partner worked through it methodically over the course of 6 weeks, interviewing owners, checking alibis, cross-referencing with any known sex offender registrations in the region, which in 1983 were far less comprehensive than they would later become. One name stood out. A man named Terrence Foote, 41 years old, a former textile equipment repairman who had left the Monaghan plant 8 months before Nora disappeared, following an unspecified complaint that had been handled internally, and whose records the plant's HR department declined to share. Foote drove a 1979 Ford LTD, white. He lived 6 minutes from Orchard Hill Drive. He had no criminal record. He submitted to an interview and was cooperative throughout. He had an alibi for the evening of July 19th. He had been at a bar with 2 men he named, and both men confirmed it. And a subsequent polygraph produced no conclusive result. Tully found him uncomfortable in a way he could not place and could not prove. Foote was released. The alibi held. The second line of inquiry attempted to locate any family or acquaintance connections that might have drawn Nora away from the yard voluntarily. There were none that checked out. Every adult in Nora's life was accounted for. Every neighbor was interviewed. Nothing opened. Meanwhile, June Caswell had begun keeping a separate notebook of her own, a record of every call she made, every agency she contacted, every lead she passed to Tully that she had developed herself by knocking on doors and asking questions that the department was too short-staffed to pursue in parallel. She filled 3 of these notebooks in the first year. She kept calling. She called the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, which had just been established that year in 1984. She called the FBI field office in Columbia. She called the Greenville News and the Spartanburg Herald-Journal. She kept Nora's photograph circulating in the way that only a mother who has decided that stopping means losing will keep a photograph circulating. Dale Caswell worked the second shift and drove home and sat at the kitchen table. He did not know what to do with his hands, in a situation that required no maintenance and had no parts to order and no scheduled repair. The house on Orchard Hill Drive, which had always run on routine, ran on grief now. Priscilla went to school and came home and watched her parents and did not know how to help them. She was 17. She tried to be invisible and present at the same time, which is the particular impossible assignment of older children in grieving households. By the end of 1984, the active investigation had produced no arrests and no new physical evidence. Tully kept the file open. He kept the name at the top of every page. By 1990, 7 years had passed. Jim Tully had been promoted to sergeant, and the Nora Caswell file had been reclassified as inactive, though Tully had never formally accepted that classification in any internal sense that mattered. The shoebox of 6 notebooks sat in the Caswell home, which June and Dale had not sold and did not intend to sell. They had lived on Orchard Hill Drive for 22 years, and the house was where Nora knew to find them. And that was the only logic that applied. By 1995, 12 years had passed. Terrence Foote had moved from Greer to a property in Anderson County, about 40 miles southwest, records showed. He had married briefly and divorced. He continued to be, in every way the outside world could observe, an ordinary man of no particular distinction, living a quiet life that produced no headlines and no complaints. By 2001, 18 years had passed. Dale Caswell had retired from the plant, which had reduced its workforce significantly in the late 90s. He drove to the Greer Police Department twice a year and sat with whoever the current case coordinator was and asked if there was anything new. There never was. He drove home. He mowed the lawn. He kept the grass on Orchard Hill Drive the way he had always kept it, as if maintenance were still a language the situation could understand. Jim Tully retired in 2004. He packed his personal case files and took the photocopies he had made of the original investigation materials and put them in a box in his home office in Taylors, 12 miles east of Greer. He told his wife, Lorraine, that he wasn't finished with one of them. She already knew. By 2010, 27 years had passed. June Caswell had been diagnosed with early-stage dementia and had moved to an assisted care facility in Spartanburg. Before she moved, she packed the shoebox of notebooks and her own 3 investigation notebooks and gave them to Priscilla, who had stayed in Greer and who kept them in a cabinet in her kitchen, and who had her sister's face in a frame on the wall of every room she had ever lived in as an adult. Then, in the fall of 2022, a city contractor clearing debris from a condemned property on Millbrook Road in Greer, a house that had stood empty since the mid-1990s, formerly rented to a series of short-term tenants whose names were only partially documented in county records, opened the basement and found, among the detritus of decades of abandonment, a chest freezer that had not been plugged in since approximately 1984. Inside, sealed in a layer of plastic sheeting that had done its job better than anyone would have predicted, were a cardboard box, a pair of work gloves, and a Ziploc bag. And inside the Ziploc bag, preserved by cold and plastic and the particular luck of objects that survive because no one thinks to destroy them properly, was a notebook. A child's notebook. A blue cover, slightly warped at the edges. On the front, in careful block letters, "My important things." Every case on this channel represents weeks of digging through records, tracking down sources, and piecing together the lives behind the headlines. If you want us to keep doing that work, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. We read every single one. Now, let's get back to Nora Caswell. The notebook was inventoried and logged and transported to the Greenville County Sheriff's Office Evidence Facility on a Tuesday afternoon in October 2022. By the following morning, Detective Sergeant Anita Rawls, a 14-year cold case specialist who had been assigned a review of pre-1990 unsolved child disappearance cases in the county, had the notebook in her hands. She had been working the Nora Caswell file for 2 years. She had read the original investigation reports, Jim Tully's index cards, the notes from June Caswell's personal investigation notebooks. She knew what Nora's handwriting looked like from the 6 notebooks in the shoebox. She opened the blue notebook and looked at the first page for a long time. What was inside was this: a record, a child's record in a child's hand, of things Nora Caswell had observed and considered important in the weeks before she disappeared. There were bird sightings with dates. There were notes about the neighbors and their dogs. There was a page that Rawls would later describe, in her official report, as a log of a vehicle, a pale car that Nora had seen driving slowly on Orchard Hill Drive on multiple occasions in the weeks before July 19th. She had noted the dates. She had noted approximate times. She had noted, with the careful specificity of a child who paid close attention to the world around her, a partial plate number. 4 characters. Not the whole plate. 4 characters that Nora Caswell, 9 years old, had considered important enough to write down. Rawls stared at the partial plate. Then she pulled up the original case file on her screen. Then she looked at Tully's notes on Terrence Foote and the white 1979 Ford LTD. She ran the partial against the plate on record for that vehicle. 3 of the 4 characters matched. She called Jim Tully at his home in Taylor's. "The notebook is real," she said. And Nora saw the car. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "What are the other characters?" "1 off," she said. 1 plate off." "He had another one," Tully said immediately. "I always thought he had 2 vehicles." Rawls had already begun pulling Foote's full motor vehicle history. The picture that assembled over the following 6 months was the picture of a man who had lived his entire adult life in the practiced stillness of someone who had learned that the less space you take up, the less likely anyone is to look closely at the space you occupy. Terrence Foote was 79 years old in 2022. He was living on his Anderson County property with a small garden and 2 dogs and a reputation among the handful of neighbors who knew him as a solitary but unremarkable presence. He had, records confirmed, owned a second vehicle in 1983, a 1978 Chevrolet Caprice Classic, white, registered under a variation of his middle name to a post office box address, a detail that had not surfaced in the original investigation because the registration predated the consolidation of South Carolina's DMV records into a searchable statewide database by 2 years. The plate on the Caprice matched Nora's 4 characters exactly. The condemned house on Millbrook Road had been rented between 1981 and 1986 to a tenant named Terry Greer, Foote's mother's maiden name, records confirmed, after investigators pulled his birth certificate. The lease had been cash. The landlord, long dead, had kept minimal records. The connection between Foote and the Millbrook Road property had never been established in the original investigation because no one had known to look for it. What had been kept in that freezer and what it documented became the evidentiary foundation of the case against Terrence Foote. The cardboard box contained additional materials that investigators would not describe in public detail during the pre-trial period, beyond confirming that they were consistent with the case. The notebook, by itself, placed Foot's vehicle on Orchard Hill Drive in the weeks before Nora disappeared and linked the plate directly to a vehicle registered in his mother's name. Combined with cell tower records from the Millbrook Road vicinity, obtained through historical carrier archives, and a forensic examination of materials recovered from the property that connected biological trace evidence to Nora Caswell through mitochondrial DNA comparison with Priscilla's submitted sample. The case built itself in the way that cold cases sometimes do when one piece of evidence finally finds the thread it was always waiting to find. Terrence Foot was arrested at his Anderson County property on a Wednesday morning in April of 2023. Two investigators from the Greenville County Sheriff's Office and a detective from the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division drove out at 6 in the morning. He came to the door in a bathrobe. He looked at the arrest warrant. He said nothing. He put out food for his dogs before they took him. The community reaction in Greer was not immediate. It moved through the town slowly, the way news of that kind moves through places that have been carrying something heavy without naming it. First disbelief, then the particular cold recognition of a truth you have half known for a long time without proof. People who had grown up on Orchard Hill Drive called each other. People who had known the Caswells drove past the house on their way to work and thought about June. Foot was charged with first-degree kidnapping and murder. He entered a not guilty plea. The trial date was set for 2024. Under South Carolina statute, the charges carry a potential sentence of life imprisonment. Jim Tully drove to the Greenville County Sheriff's Office the afternoon of the arrest. He sat with Anita Rawls for an hour in a conference room, and she showed him the notebook behind glass, and he read the entries Nora had made and did not speak for a while. He had written her name at the top of his case notes for 39 years. He said, when he did speak, that she had always been the best investigator on this case. He meant it. Priscilla Caswell, 54 years old, received the call from Detective Rawls on the morning of the arrest. She was in her kitchen. She sat down on the floor, which is where her husband found her 20 minutes later, still holding the phone. She was not crying. She was reading something on the screen. Rawls had sent her a photograph, a single page from the blue notebook, a page that showed her sister's handwriting in careful block letters, precise and alive, recording the world with the full attention of a child who had always believed that what she noticed mattered. June Caswell did not live to see the arrest. She died in 2018, having lost by then much of the language she had used for 40 years to describe what her daughter had meant to her and what her disappearance had cost. But the notebooks she kept, 3 volumes of calls made and leads pursued and agencies contacted, are part of the official case record now, cited in the investigative summary as foundational to understanding the timeline of the original investigation. Her name is in the file. It belongs there. Nora Caswell was 9 years old. She noticed things, small things, specific things that other people passed without seeing. She noticed the pale car on her street weeks before it mattered, and she wrote down what she saw in the careful, serious hand of a child who understood, in the way that children sometimes understand things more clearly than adults, that the world deserved to be documented accurately. She was right. She had been right the whole time. What does it mean that a 9-year-old child's private notebook, sealed in a freezer for 39 years, survived long enough to close the case it was never meant to be part of? What does it say about the institutional gaps in 1983 that a second vehicle registration under a variation of a name could remain invisible for 4 decades in the same state where a little girl went missing? And what do we owe to the investigators like Jim Tully, who carry a name at the top of every page long after the file is officially closed, because they understand that officially closed and actually finished are not the same thing? Justice came for Nora Caswell after 39 years. Stories like hers remind us that truth, however late, always finds its way to the light. If you believe that too, Subscribe so you don't miss the next case. And if you want more solved cold cases, the links are waiting in the description. Thank you for watching.